So I'm Carol Hall, and I'm from the League of Women Voters. And about 3 years ago, I sat down with Ann, and we decided I had some issues about wanting to know more about water here. And you'll find out if you've seen the film or you stay and see the film, how that developed. And she and I had this idea that we could do an educational outreach program for people in our community and our watershed about the importance of our water and what the future is for our water and what the challenges are that are facing us. So we're really happy to see so many of you interested in the same thing that we have been so interested in. And she's been interested in water for a long time. So let me introduce Ann. She has a master's degree in water resource administration from the University of Arizona. She moved here in 1991. So how many people have been here longer than 1991? So that tells us something, right? She went to work for Callum County on water management in the Dungeness Watershed. 22 years later, she was hired by the city of Sequim to produce its first ever stormwater management plan. We got really ahead of the ball with her because she did this for us. Ann enjoys working on Sequim's many water resources, from deep aquifers to the kitchen tap, and from the city's water reclamation plan to water storage reservoirs. So I think we're going to learn a lot from Ann tonight. I always learn something from Ann when I sit down and let her talk, okay? So thank you very much again for coming and participating, and we hope to see you again. Okay, and this is Ann.
Hi, everybody. Wow. What a delight to have such a big captive audience. And thank you, Carol, wherever you went. And also thanks to Carol Creasy, who is the hydrogeologist with Clallam County, and John Stednick, who Carol pointed out, both of which have collaborated with me on this talk and what we really need to cover and top points to hit. So Carol couldn't be here tonight, unfortunately, but John's here, so he's my backup, and he's definitely gonna, the stories that come out of Colorado would put us spinning, because we think we have big stuff going on here. We know nothing. Imagining a day without water, we actually can do that here, because in 2015 it almost happened, and I'll get to that after a bit. But that brings to mind the moniker "where water is wealth," which is what has been used by City of Sequim since way back when the Western settlers first came, and water literally did turn into wealth because they harnessed the Dungeness River and they were able to farm and make a lot more progress and a lot more money. But water is also health, and water is the essence of life, and that's why I've been a student of water since 1988. That's what my blog says. And now you guys can be students of water too. And I'm excited to take you on a tour of our watershed. We're going to give the fundamentals in that first section, and then the second and third. We'll touch on a lot of graphs and charts. Hopefully you won't get too dazzled. I'll try to touch on just the highlights, but it's a very data intensive topic. So we have a lot of ways to measure water, and we use all of them. So hopefully that'll be of interest to you guys. And then wrapping it up. I also wanted to point out that, as Carol said, this is one of the most studied watersheds in the state and probably the nation, given that Washington State is particularly involved in water management compared to other states. So some of the key documents come from federal agencies like the U.S. Geological Survey. This one also, a couple of the key, if anybody wants to look at this document later, it's online. All these documents are online. This one is called the 2008 Hydrogeologic Monitoring Report by a consulting company, Pacific Groundwater Group. They've done many studies around here, but there's just lots and lots of resources and lots to know. it's a fascinating hydrologic place and human history combined with that. What we have here is local people who are determined to keep their way of life, whether it's farming or harvesting salmon and shellfish or something else. But to keep that vision has required cooperation because of some of the issues that you'll see today. And it's required long meetings, hiring the state and hiring consultants to help do these studies and figure things out about, you know, how we can all move forward together. And there's lots of trust and goodwill involved. So it's been a really interesting almost 30 years for me. All right, so what could be better? Starting with the Ice Age. And this is an illustration of how far south the most recent ice sheet came down from. The Cordilleran ice sheet started in the Canadian mountains, what we call Canada now. And you can see where Sequim is, the green star. The ice was about 4,000 feet thick there, which, to give you scale, is lower than the mountaintops here, but only about 1,000 feet lower. So not that the ice was starting at sea level, so it's kind of is just sort of giving you a relative idea of how deep that is. And then there were alpine glaciers as well. The alpine glaciers in the mountains were advancing and retreating, just like the ice sheet was advancing and retreating. So the Dungeness Peninsula was a very active place for 2 million years. The most recent glaciation was about 13,000 years ago. Picture on the left is the Elwha River. When, after the dams were removed, you can see how much sediment is coming out of that river and how much deposited in a huge new beach, which hadn't formed yet when this picture was taken, but now this whole area is solid, very coarse sand that came out of those reservoirs. So you can imagine that happening on a scale, you know, this size scale for 2 million years. And the most recent one left evidence that proto-Dungeness went out different directions before it landed where it is now, where we see it now. And then all of that moving of the ice and the rivers created this layer situation, that you can see here. And this is a geologist's interpretation of many well logs, which look like this, with the well driller saying, here's gray rocky clay from 80 to 84, and brown something material from 84 to 90. And, you know, a lot of study goes into what the well drillers wrote on the well log to figure out what we have under the ground here. So if you've gone to Port Williams Beach and seen those bluffs, that's what we have underground, something like that. Here it is in 3D. This is roughly, you know, from the foothills. This is obviously a very simplified situation, but from the foothills downstream with the layers underneath and the groundwater flow direction. There's what we call an aquifer, would be these dotted ones, 1, 3, and 5, and an aquitard, where the water doesn't flow through very well, 2 and 4. Below layer 5, aquifer, which is the third aquifer, the lower aquifer, it just is undifferentiated. We don't really know what's down there, whether it's a lot more sand and gravel or a lot more till and very fine-grained stuff. But below that, we know there's bedrock. We know that there's a fault that creates kind of the steep mountains behind us to the south and dives deep down under the strait to the north. So interesting side note is the well on Dungeness Spit at the lighthouse is 650 feet deep, and or so, it's roughly that. And that well log is really valuable because the material that driller went through was well documented and can be used to tie together to the deposits that are up this direction, and then you get these nice, you know, confirmation of where your aquifers are and how deep they are and how steeply they dip. Now, if you've been out there and you've ever noticed the little pond, that is actually created by the pressure on the lowest part of that well is so great that it pushes the water up the well and out the top. It's called flowing artesian when you've got that situation, and it's flowing enough to create this little pond. They don't have it, they do have it regulated to some degree. It's not free flowing as much as it might want to, which is good because otherwise we drain the aquifer, right? So that's fun. So the glacial deposits left us with the soils that we've got now, and this kind of shows that same pattern of the coarse soils, the alluvial soils going in the old Dungeness channels. And then we've got fine-grained material where we have till, and that creates a different situation. You've got, different pockets of clay material, the big squim potato cobbles that people find in their yard. You can imagine that used to be river bottom. And then a view that you're a little more familiar with. Here's our Dungeness coming out of the foothills here, and when it hits the flats, you've got two more tributaries that join it, Matriotti and Hurd, and then Meadowbrook Creek joins it right at the mouth. Independent drainages on the west are Seabird and McDonald, and then to the north, Castleberry, Guerin, and then Bell actually starts in the foothills here. So does Johnson and Jimmy Come Lately. Guerin and Castleberry and Meadowbrook are all spring creeks. They do not start in the mountains. Right, so that gives us the framework. Now we'll add water. The old friend, our hydrologic cycle with the different stages that we're going to go through. Precipitation, landing as snow and rain, surface runoff, and which recharges into the ground, as does the rain, and then evaporation and transpiration when the temperature comes up. All right, so this view is from Google Earth, and it pretty much covers the whole watershed. Here's Sequim Bay, and here's our Dungeness River, and the main stem comes right up here, practically directly south of where it leaves the watershed. And this little tributary is Heather Creek. Royal Creek is here. Here's the Grey Wolf system coming up this way. The actual Grey Wolf River is this one. This middle fork is the Cameron, and then this one is the Grand. If you've done any hiking, this is wonderful hiking, of course. Here's Blue Mountain. Everybody can see Blue Mountain from Sequim, from all over. And I think this is Mount Cameron right here, where what you can actually see it from downtown Sequim, looking right up this drainage. I think you're looking at Mount Cameron. It's peaking between two forested ridges, but if you look from the right spots, you can see a glaciated or snow-covered peak, really rocky peak in the very back of the watershed, and that's the top of our watershed. Measurement-wise, we've got a few things here. I'm going to zoom in first at our snow stations. We've got the National Park Service runs this snow survey up here at Deer Park. That was mentioned in the film. Since 1949, they've been getting measurements up there. And then the Dungeness Snowtell station is in Silver Creek, a tributary of the Dungeness. Since 1999, we've been getting measurements there. And that's elevation 4,000 feet. This one's right around 5, I think, maybe 5,500. And then Streamflow, we measure Streamflow at the USGS gauge, river mile 11.2, and that is a nice long record. Since 1924, they've had that gauge going. The state put in a gauge up here at Schoolhouse Bridge in '99. So those two are very key points for gathering information about the conditions in the Dungeness. Oh, and then our weather station is called Sequim 2E, and it's at the water reclamation facility, our wastewater treatment plant down by Washington Harbor on Schmuck Road. Okay, and then here's the view that you're probably more familiar with some of those landmarks. as well. Okay, well, we're just gonna jump now to talk about precipitation. The blue hole, what we're famous for, banana belt, rain shadow. It's definitely a rain shadow. You can see how the mountains capture all the moisture, and then by the time the weather fronts reach us, they don't have much rain left. Anywhere from 15 to 30 inches a year is normal around Sequim, depending on where you're at. Over here in Forks, these contours are right around 140, 130. So that's 10 times more rain than what we get over here. The monthly seasonal cycle, interesting. I was quite interested that it's very normal to have a half an inch of rain in both July and August. I think this year was pretty normal. I know I was disappointed that we had so much rain in July and August, but it was actually normal. Most of the rain comes in just November, December, January. These averages are based on 1980 to 2007. I have a caveat that most of the data I'm presenting tonight is relatively old. It's often 10 years or more since a study like the ones I pointed out have been done. Not that a whole lot changes, but on the water side, it definitely changes. The framework doesn't change, but the numbers do. So basically, a half an inch to 2.5 inches is our normal amount per month. Another thing about this year, our September, we had 2.9 inches of rain in September. Wow. Yeah, that was another shocker. Moving on to streamflow. In the Dungeness, streamflow is a combination of rainy season. Here, this is a calendar. Oh, let me start with this background on this graph. What we have here is, on the left, daily mean discharge. Discharge means flow. So the scale is 0 to 1,000 cubic feet per second. A cubic foot per second is roughly a basketball. So think about, 100 basketballs per second down here, 1,000 basketballs per second up here. Again, these are daily means. So when you have a big storm in the winter and the flow in the river just looks like it's raging and it's brown and it's bubbling and it's coming up the banks, that's probably 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. I've seen it get to 7,000 before, but you can see that our daily means in the winter are only 500. And this is the upper 75th percentile. The median is down here at 300. Compare that to this nice, reliable part of the hydrograph that shows the river flow coming up in about April and May and peaking in June and July and coming down until September. That's snowmelt season, which has been very reliable for a long time. And you can imagine the farmers who started realizing the river comes up every single year in April. All that water is going out into the ocean. What should we do about it? And they built ditches. 67 years of record here on these graphs, but they end in 96. So it's not real recent. This shows us it repeats the monthly averages for rainfall. When we've got the rain dropping down, we've got the river coming up. And then before the rain, and then this is evidence of the rains coming and bringing that river back up again after this, what we call the critical period, where everybody needs water in that September time frame. Here's 2015. Wow. You can see it changed everything. It was so far below what was known before in terms of the typical flows. This is the 25th percentile. The green is the long-term median. I think that's it for that one. We'll move on to a small stream hydrograph, we've got CFS on the left. Instead of going from 0 to 1,000, it goes from 0 to 3.5. Completely different scale. On the bottom, the other thing is that this is showing us more of the water year, which is the way hydrologists think about the year. The year starts in October when the rains come and finishes in September when your bank account is spent and you really need that rain to start building up again. So Gearin Creek is spring-fed, like I mentioned, and so this groundwater base flow that it relies on, or that provides the at least one CFS in the dry season, is the base flow, and this wintertime rain, and again, most of our rain comes in November, December, January, and you can see the flow in Gearin Creek really reflecting that. This little bump here is probably because it gets a little bit of irrigation's tailwater, either through the ground or directly. Otherwise, it would be a smooth curve down. So you can see, as far as small creeks go, stream flow equals precipitation, no snowmelt, but groundwater base flow plus irrigation tailwater. Where does that base flow come from? Well, when we've got, this is our layer cake of, predominantly sands and gravels for the aquifers and predominantly clays and tills in the aquitards. You've got a lot of pressure building up. All the water going into those pore spaces in the sands and gravels can only move so fast, and as it gets closer to the marine area, it's impenetrable, right? You're not just going to push fresh water into salt water without a lot of pressure building up. So that's what it does. It builds up, but at the point where it's too much, it follows the path of least resistance, which is up. So I mean, these arrows going straight up are just representative that the up-down flow is up rather than down. It doesn't mean that it's going straight up. So it's this particular drawing came from, I think, one of the USGS reports. Here's where the lighthouse well, how it looks in relation to the aquifers. It's tapping that middle zone. You can see it 650 feet deep. So that's where the base flow comes from, is when we've got groundwater making its way back out of the ground. Here is the groundwater flow direction, which is generally south to north, but off and on it takes a turn slightly east or slightly west. The lines represent the contour, the elevation of the water table. All right, so this is probably obvious. You've heard of a losing stream and a gaining stream. It's just a matter of whether the water table is at the elevation of the stream. If it's higher, the water is going to go in. If it's lower, the water is going to go out. And this is an example of a study that was done to actually figure out which reaches of the river are gaining and which are losing. And that was done in about 2000. Another kind of a little bit repeated illustration, but we've got recharge area here on the surface of the land with percolation down through the unsaturated zone, hitting the water table and making its way through the forces of gravity into the stream if the water table is higher than the stream. You add a well to that, and the well is intercepting some of that water on its way to the stream. You pump that well higher than it was before, more than it was before, and you've captured some of the water out of the stream. You've now got a water table that's below the stream, and the net flow is the other direction. So all of these connections between ground and surface water, I think you get the point. That is the point. There's a lot of connections. Here's an example showing how aquifers are connected. This blue trace is the water level. So these are hydrographs for a well rather than a stream. These are water levels in wells. This one is the shallow aquifer, this is the middle, and this is the deep. This first green line shows in the summer when water levels drop down in the wells because people are pumping more out to water their outdoor plants and lawns. that's what happens. The water level drops, and the middle aquifer is similar to that, but the top aquifer, the shallow aquifer, something different's happening. Apparently it's benefiting from all of that watering that's going on, whereas the deeper aquifers just drop down in that season. In the winter, this is the kind of the stable flow in the winter in the lower aquifer. Here it is in the middle, and whereas in the winter, this second line shows you that the water level is actually lower in this particular shallow aquifer well in the winter than it is in the summer. Of course, we've also got an irrigation system that's been going for over a century, and that has a lot to do with our groundwater system because it's been leaking ever since it was built. Not intentionally, but I think if you saw the film, you saw Ben Smith saying, hey, sometimes we had to put 2 CFS in at the top to get 1 CFS at the end just because there was so much going into the ground. That's all unintentional and not the best water management. So all the colored lines here are piped and lined ditches currently, not even current. This is in 2008. There's a lot more that's been piped and lined since then. The blue lines are open ditch. The darkest lines are abandoned ditch, and all the other colors are piped and lined ditches based on when they were done. But again, this is more than 10 years old, so a lot more has been actually, the blue would actually be colors. So you've heard about all these different ways that groundwater flows or surface and groundwater are connected. So now we can talk about a groundwater budget for the area. This work was based on 2 years of data collection by volunteers that were connected with the USGS hydrogeologic assessment. This report, Blake Thomas was the researcher on that, and I was the grant manager at the county, and we had probably 40 volunteers around the watershed, either helping us with a precipitation gauge, a stream gauge on an irrigation ditch, a stream gauge on a creek, or in fact, he also had a small area that he was doing a recharge study, literally measuring how much moisture got into a tiny little, I forget what they're called, but little unit that went into the soil and measured soil moisture. So that was telling us, all right, this is an example of an area where we actually measured recharge going into the soil. So the point with this, I wanted to show, first of all, that 2-year data collection period turned out to be wetter than normal. So it's not actually representative of the normal, but we know that it's wetter than normal. But this here is what keeps coming back to me, is that this is about 25% of our total recharge is relying on the river. So the river does leak a lot. We said it had gains and losing stretches, reaches. 25% of our groundwater budget is relying on this happening. So when the river flow is lower than normal, so is our recharge. And then, of course, the irrigation, this isn't hardly happening anymore at all, which makes this even more important. Well, I shouldn't say at all, just much less. The inflow from underneath the mountains from subsurface, and then this is from incident precipitation direct going into the ground. Oh, septic systems are not considered an input. I think it was just too small of a number to bother putting up here. The well discharge, if this is the outside, the outside of things, discharge is another way to say it. Wells is one of those categories, and you can see it's on fairly low percent of the total. Septic recharge coming from that well use would be even smaller up on this chart. And then the last part of the hydrologic cycle, the evaporation, is directly related to temperature. Anywhere from freezing, is our lowest. About freezing is our lowest average monthly temperature, and 70 is about our our highest. So we've touched on the human interface with the hydrologic system, with the framework, but we're going to go into more detail on well withdrawals, diversions, and what we call artificial recharge. This graph, or this chart, shows the darker colors show a higher consumptive water use. The greens are the lowest compared to the others, but these are all what we call Group A water systems, drawing water out of the ground. The Group A systems are the city, the PUD, Sunland, Montera, anything over 25 people or 15 connections is called a Group A. So that's what this represents, and you can see their total 1.7 million gallons a day is the average use from those kinds of water systems. These are the numbers of wells in the square mile section that you see there. And in this case, the domestic and Group Bs would be anything smaller. So all the small community systems and the private wells all combined. Interestingly, the two groups are the same amount of water being drawn. And so the number here, 3.4 million gallons per day, which if you're a water system manager, that might mean something, but the CFS number might be a little more understandable. We're talking about CFS in Garin Creek being 0 to 3, the Dungeness 0 to 1,000, 5.5 and a quarter CFS for the withdrawals for residential. And that's, again, old data.
That's all of them?
That's what that was, yeah. This was an
Total
analysis
of all of them.
done in 2008, yeah. Again, another from the same report. This is just kind of a historical look at irrigation diversions. The irrigators did a lot of conservation. They've improved their efficiency on farm. They've fixed their leaks. The number of farms has gone down. So they are not diverting nearly as much as they used to. It's really halved. This is 1979 here up to 2006. So the most recent data we have is showing maybe 50 to 65 CFS on average, and they divert between April 15th and September 15th. So for those months. So that gives you a sense for the scale on irrigation diversions. And then recharge, we have various ways that we put water back in the ground, which I'm glad about. Septic systems actually put water back in the ground, so I hope you're maintaining your septic system and making sure it's putting clean water back into the ground. Irrigation ditches, as we've talked about, unless they're piped or lined. And then stormwater. In the city, we have an ordinance that says you must put the stormwater that ends up on your property, the rainwater that ends up in your property, try and get it into the ground if you at all can. And on our city streets, we have dry wells and different facilities that get it into the ground too. We do not have a piped stormwater system like most cities do in Western Washington. So that's a good thing. We are conserving that water. So now we're up to looking into the future. I'm not going to say I'm predicting future trends, but we can say what we have heard, what the studies are saying about climate change and what is likely to happen. In terms of precipitation, we are likely to have our winter storms are going to be more intense, more often, not all the time, but on average, the average number of really intense storms is going to go up. Less precipitation, so drier summers, but roughly the annual amount might not change too much. So it's going to come in bigger storms that are compacted in the winter rather than spread throughout the year. So what are the impacts of that? Quite a bit. You can imagine that, the streamflow changes are obvious. You're going to have bigger flows in the winter, lower flows in the summer. You also get less recharge because the water flow, that nice snowmelt flow that comes up in the summer and goes down gradually in the late summer, is no longer as much. There's not as much water there. Also, more runoff means less recharge. Your runoff, if you have bigger storms, it's hitting the ground and the ground can't handle it as quickly. So it ends up in your ditches and your creeks and goes out to the marine area. So instead of that going into the ground, we're going to have more running off, which means drier soils, more prone to wildfire, and more. Declining glaciers. This is the Lillian former glacier in 2010. Just over this ridge is the Dungeness watershed. The Lillian's not in the Dungeness, but it's just on the top of it, on the other side. There is an older picture of it. I couldn't find it today, so I was just using this one, but you can see, used to be called the Lillian Glacier. Now we wouldn't even call it that. The same thing is happening in our basins, just at the top of Mount Cameron, Grey Wolf, Royal, some of those other basins that used to have bigger snowfields and small glaciers in the Dungeness. Here's the Deer Park snow survey data that the National Park Service has been collecting since 1949. Bill Bacchus on November 13th is the next lecture, and he'll be going into this in detail, I'm sure. So I won't go into it, but you can see what looks like a declining trend there. The green is the SNOTEL, which came in 1999, and it gets a lot more data, a lot more continuous data compared to the Deer Park data. Changing stream flow. We've got the green. I'm going to touch on a couple things here. First of all, to orient you, this is a exponential or geometric scale. So here's 100, but it goes down, it spreads it out. Here's 200, 300, 400, 500, and then you up here, 100 CFS is only that big compared to down here, it's this big. So it makes this graph look funny. It's very different than the first one we saw. But it's a good illustration of, here's the long-term, like most of our data shows, and this is a very long-term data set, 90 years. The normal is the green, and that's between the 25th and the 75th percentile of the time we have what's going on in the green. Those are our stream flows. On either side of that is the next 15%. We've got 10th to the 25th is the brown, and the 75th to the 90th is the light blue. And the purple is the highest percentage, and the red is the lowest. You can see the red traces the 2015 on this scale. On this, with all this data, this is how it lines up. You've got the winter looks fairly normal, maybe even on the high side in terms of precipitation. The problem was that it wasn't cold enough, so it didn't freeze. We didn't get the snowpack. Here's what happens when you don't get the snowpack. Boom, it formed the lowest known record in 2015. Here's where the rain came in the end of August in 2015 and saved everybody. Well, saved the fish more than anything else. And 2019 is the black trace, which, doesn't look that unusual, but it might be considered normal. It fits in the green pretty well, but look at some key things. Doesn't really show the higher winter flows, but it shows the earlier snowmelt start. Here it started in March. You can see this starting to go up in March as opposed to April. It shows an earlier snowmelt peak. Here is the peak, used to be at the end of June, and now, or this year it was at the end of May. And then a lower snowmelt peak, here it is down here. Well, no, it's actually in the average area. But then the lower critical period flow, here we are getting down here. It goes from being green to being red. So that's considered, this was not an unusual year. We had decent snowpack, but it just didn't make it. It wasn't enough. It wasn't cold enough, and it melted fast. Okay, aquifer levels. This is looking overwhelming, I'm sure. Bear with me. I need to orient you. You can see in the background is our watershed. These dots are all wells. Green means it's a shallow aquifer well, blue is middle, and yellow is lower. So what we're going to do is zoom in to a couple things and focus on them. Here's a couple wells right by the Dungeness River. You can see that the trace of the hydrograph for this well is pretty stable. It's not going down too much. This side axis shows the departure from wherever the data started. So here's the 0 point. It is down a little bit. Over here, something similar. Here's the 0 point, and it goes just down a little bit over the long term. But since it's near the river, I imagine it's pretty connected to that big, what they call hyporheic zone, very saturated area right under the river. Okay, we're going to zoom over to Agnew, and we've got a shallow aquifer well and a middle aquifer well. What's going on here? Here it goes from 0 down to minus 14 over the period. I believe these are 10-year increments. We have groundwater data that goes back to the late 70s and 1980, so a lot of these wells have been measured for a long time. That's why they're being used in this study. This middle aquifer well is similar, 0 down to about 9 feet is where we have the end of the data there. And then panning over to Port Williams well field, these are the monitoring wells around here. You can see where a lot of them have gone from 0 down about 5 feet, down about 5 to 10 feet. And, was that because of the pumping? Was it because of the irrigation ditch lining and piping that stopped as much recharge going in? Is it because we've had less rain over the long term? Or is it, what are the factors that are causing this decline? It's not a decline everywhere, but we do see it happening. Growing population. All right, this is kind of a famous thing that shows up at most water talks is the number of wells we have. Clallam County, especially the Dungeness area, has probably more wells in this, 30 to 60 square mile area than any other part of the state, I believe. So yeah, I don't know the number. I think it's over 8,000. It might be over 9,000 wells in this area. These data are all back from 2007, but here's the progression. The darker square mile sections are the higher numbers. The yellows are lower, and the numbers inside those squares are the number of wells. So here's the maximum of all the sections in 2007 anyway. It was 258, and that's kind of the neighborhood where Old Olympic, just kind of between, outside the city, because otherwise they'd be on city water. So just sort of to the northwest of the city, between Old Olympic, where it starts curving around and going to the north before it goes west again. Declining water quality. This also is data that goes through 2007, but you can see the progression here. The colors on the dots indicate the source, whether it was the county, the federal, or the state data. The size of the dots indicates the quantity of nitrates. So the littlest dots are basically undetectable or not undetectable, but not considered to be influenced by human activities, less than 1 milligram per liter of nitrate. The biggest dots are greater than 10 has been found. And these are just spot checks. This is not, they don't always have that concentration, but we have found at least one that reached this high, for example. 10 is the drinking water limit. So drinking more than that is putting your health at risk. So I hope folks with their private wells are testing for nitrates and aware if they're over 10. It's not very common, but it does happen, you can see. out of 9,000 wells, that's not very many, but we really don't know about the other 8,000, 950. So we don't know how extensive the problem is. Nobody's looked at nitrates in the groundwater or focused on it for at least 6 or 7 years. Well, to wrap up, we are, we're still working. We're hoping that you guys will become students of water. Water's always moving, above ground, below ground, in between. It's changing as we use it. Something's changing about it, and then we, put it back into the system, and it's perhaps not as clean as it was before, but perhaps cleaner depending on the water. So radical changes are already happening, as you've heard, between changes in the irrigation system and farming practices and leaks and all that, and then also radical changes in the mountains. So there's more changes coming between the seasonality of our precipitation affecting our stream flow and then also the temperature of our environment. So imagining a day without water, like I said, it did happen here. The Dungeness River was so low that people were hired to come move cobbles out of the channel. You could walk in the channel. There was not nearly enough water to be worried about. So people walked into the middle of the river, moved rocks around to make sure there was a channel deep enough for fish to swim in. That was in late August of 2015 when we had essentially zero snow in the mountains. So it not only can happen, but it did happen. The point of my talk today is to inspire you to keep learning. I'm not actually going to go into a lot of things that we are doing that are positive. They are happening. Here's a quick list, but we hope that you'll stay engaged. And the wrap up of the lecture series is going to be a panel discussion on what should we be doing. What are we doing, and what more should we be doing. You're not going to look at that for very long, but there's some resources. I'm happy to share that. My business cards are on the table if anybody wants to reach me by email or calling. I think that's it for me. Questions? So the question was, are irrigation ditches being piped because of evaporation losses or because of leakage into the ground? It's mostly the leakage problem, but you're right. Evaporation is another thing that's happening, and that's conserved. The other thing is that water quality can be degraded by ditches flowing through populated areas or farms where the animals have free access. So water quality is protected also when ditches are piped.
What's the status of the reservoir that they talked about building on the Dungeness River?
Mm-hmm. So the question was about the reservoir and what is the status. It's called the off-channel Dungeness Reservoir because it's not actually on the Dungeness. It's connected with one of the irrigation ditches just to the east of the Dungeness. And so it will take water, it will not dam the Dungeness River, it will take water through an existing irrigation diversion head gate and bring it down to the reservoir site that way, and then it will continue on into the irrigation ditch on the other end of the reservoir. The status of that is the county got a grant from the state to finish the design and engineering and buy the land. So they're in the process of finalizing that grant contract and then getting a letter of intent to DNR to buy the land, and then they'll start the design. But those things are all month-long processes, so it will be probably 3 years before we finish the purchase and the design. And it's the county's project. Yeah.
So does the water taken out of the river, does that help recharge our aquifer?
When you say the water taken out of the river
For irrigation.
for irrigation.
Irrigation rather than letting it run out into the street. straight.
Yeah, so the water taken out of the river into irrigation canals is used for the farms. It also recharges the groundwater. However, the water rights that the irrigators got to take the water out of the river add up to more water than is in the river. So that's why there's been this conflict for a long time. Back in the 20s, the state didn't realize, or before the 20s, that they were giving away legal water rights to irrigation companies for more water than the river contains at that time of year. So, yeah, using it is a great idea, great thing, and that's why storing it in the midsummer when we have that snowmelt flow to use in the late summer rather than taking more water out of the river is the design behind the reservoir. So that way we're conserving water in the river but still have water for irrigation. And these are topics that are going to be dealt with in depth in a couple of the lectures coming up. So your card kind of describes what we've got: water law, irrigators and protectors, stormwater and water quality, safeguarding our salmon's future, and then conservation, and then our water future is the panel at the end. Okay, yep.
Is there a certain amount of fresh water that needs to go into the ocean to, I mean, is it necessary? I'm questioning that. Because people go, oh, if you don't use it, it's just gonna go into the ocean.
Yeah, is
there a
there?
certain amount that needs to go in?
Sure.
For balance?
So the question was, is water just going into the ocean a bad thing? Of course not. That's how our ecology evolved, was to have these streams letting fresh water into the estuaries, mixing with the salt water, and then the salmon coming and going need that brackish water both directions probably. I'm not sure about that, but there's a lot of organisms that do thrive and require fresh water as a component of being past the shoreline. So that
salt water.
yeah, they wouldn't thrive in salt water, but they can't survive in purely fresh water either. That's why they're at that margin. The edges of our landscapes are usually the most diverse places. So, okay, one more.
Are there any plans to update the data that you've presented in the report?
Great question. Are there any plans to update the data? Well, since I started putting this talk together, I've been speaking with my colleagues at the city and realizing that the city is the one that did this awesome report. It was before I worked here, but this could be updated, I think, pretty, without a whole lot of work. I don't think the city staff has the time or capacity or ability to pull it off, but if we talk to the folks that did it before, perhaps an update wouldn't be that expensive or that hard to come by or take that long. We don't have to start from scratch. So yeah, I'm starting to talk about it, and certainly our partners at the county would be interested, because this doesn't just cover the city, it covers the whole watershed. All right. I always forget to mention that I have a blog. But if you want to follow me, this is my blog, and it's basically just the articles that I put into the Gazette. If you've noticed, the Water Matters column, that's mine. That comes out about monthly in the Gazette, and I put all those articles online, so they're here, and it's a fun way to look back at what we were talking about last year, or what were the numbers. I have a geek moment at the end of all my articles that talks about what was the river flow in the last month and what is it right now, and same with the precipitation. All right, I guess that's it for me. Thanks, everybody.